What if almost everything you believe about growing your own food was built around a quiet, incredibly profitable dependency cycle? Not a conspiracy. Not some fringe theory whispered through obscure corners of the internet. Something slower than that. Something so normalized, most people never stop long enough to question it. The gradual disappearance of plants that once fed entire civilizations without demanding constant replacement, constant repurchasing, constant restarting from zero every single year. Plants that produced continuously. Plants that stored naturally. Plants that survived harsh climates without chemical dependency. Plants that asked almost nothing from the people growing them while giving food back for decades. Before we begin, I want you to think carefully about the garden most people grew up seeing. Maybe your parents wrestled with collapsing tomato cages every summer. Maybe you remember seed trays lined up beside windows in February while snow still covered the ground outside. Maybe you watched someone in your family spend weeks hardening off fragile seedlings before spring planting. And maybe every year ended exactly the same way. Autumn arrived. Frost hit overnight. The vines blackened, the leaves collapsed into wet rot, the garden emptied into bare dirt again. Then everyone waited months to rebuild the entire system from scratch. That cycle became normal. Nobody questioned it because everyone around them accepted it too. Food appeared seasonal, temporary, fragile. Gardening became an endless loop of replacement. But what if another system existed entirely? What if some of the most productive food plants on Earth quietly disappeared from mainstream gardening culture, not because they failed, but because they worked too well? Because there is another story, and it begins thousands of feet above sea level in the Andes Mountains of South America, where survival itself demanded a completely different relationship with food. The terrain there is brutal. Thin mountain air, violent winds, sharp temperature swings between day and night. Rocky slopes where ordinary annual crops struggled just to survive. Yet civilizations flourished there for thousands of years long before industrial agriculture existed. The indigenous peoples of Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Chile solved a problem modern gardening culture rarely even acknowledges. They did not build food systems designed to collapse every winter. They built systems around permanence, around resilience, around continuity. They planted once, they maintained carefully, and they harvested continuously from plants capable of producing food year after year instead of disappearing at the end of every season. One of those plants was the Tamarillo, known in parts of the Inca world as Chilto. And if you have never heard that name before today, you are not alone. That is exactly what makes this story so strange. Because this was never some obscure ceremonial fruit hidden deep in isolated valleys. For thousands of years before European ships crossed the Atlantic, Tamarillo trees were already feeding communities throughout the Andes Mountains, not occasionally, not experimentally, as dependable food infrastructure integrated directly into daily survival. When Spanish explorers arrived during the 16th century, they found the plant everywhere, along terraced mountain hillsides carved carefully into impossible slopes, beside homes and village gardens, near cloud forests where cold-resistant crops clustered together for protection. Small, tree-like shrubs carrying heavy clusters of glossy egg-shaped fruit, unlike anything Europeans had ever seen before. The flavor reminded them vaguely of tomato, but the biology of the plant behaved completely differently from the fragile annual gardens Europe depended on. Seeds eventually crossed the Atlantic. Reports followed. Botanists documented the species. Agricultural observers described its productivity, and then something familiar happened. The knowledge arrived, and over generations, almost silently, disappeared from mainstream Western food culture. Here is what modern gardening culture almost never explains honestly. The standard tomato plant, the one stacked by the thousands outside garden centers every spring, is biologically temporary by design. Under good conditions, one tomato plant might produce roughly 30 pounds of fruit across its entire lifespan. Then it dies. The following year, the cycle begins again. New seeds, new transplants, new fertilizers, new support cages, new soil amendments, new pest treatments, new irrigation systems. The entire structure resets annually. And because everybody around you participates in the same cycle, it feels natural. But the Tamarillo does not operate inside that system at all. One Tamarillo tree planted once can continue producing fruit for nearly 2 decades. Researchers and growers have documented lifetime production exceeding 3,000 pounds of fruit from a single established tree. Stop for a second and really process that comparison carefully. One conventional tomato gives you 1 season. One Tamarillo gives you years. One system demands endless replacement. The other creates continuity. And this is where the conversation starts becoming deeply uncomfortable for modern gardening culture. Because the plant that produces year-round, stores naturally, survives for decades, and never asks you to return to the nursery, every spring somehow vanished almost entirely from mainstream backyard gardening conversations. In mild climates, Tamarillo barely even recognizes winter as a stopping point. It fruits in spring. It continues through summer. It carries ripening clusters deep into autumn long after ordinary tomato vines have collapsed from frost or been ripped from the soil entirely. Researchers at Massey University in New Zealand documented extended fruiting cycles under seasonal conditions that would destroy conventional tomato production within days. The tree evolved in the Andean highlands, where survival depended on resilience rather than convenience. It built persistence directly into its biology. But the deeper you look into the plant, the stranger the story becomes. Because the Tamarillo does not simply produce continuously. It stores itself naturally in a way modern produce systems rarely prioritize anymore. And now we arrive at the part almost nobody discusses. The fruit itself carries one of the most elegant natural preservation systems in the plant world. Most first-time growers see the thick outer skin and assume it is a flaw, something bitter, something unpleasant, something to remove as quickly as possible. But that skin is not a defect at all. It functions like biological armor. It slows oxygen exposure. It protects the flesh underneath from rapid moisture loss. It shields the fruit from bacterial breakdown in ways ordinary tomatoes simply cannot replicate. A ripe supermarket tomato begins softening within days. Tamarillo waits. Under cool storage conditions around 40 degrees Fahrenheit, the fruit remains usable for weeks. Properly prepared flesh can remain frozen for months without major quality loss. Indigenous Andean communities understood this centuries before refrigeration existed. They did not need industrial preservation systems because the plant itself already solved part of the storage problem naturally. Imagine how powerful that becomes in a world where nearly every grocery system depends entirely on refrigeration, shipping logistics, preservatives, and rapid turnover. A fruit capable of naturally protecting itself changes the equation completely. And underneath that protective skin is something nutritionally extraordinary. Researchers at Auckland University of Technology documented antioxidant activity in Tamarillo exceeding apples, oranges, red grapes, kiwi fruit, and pineapple. Think carefully about how globally dominant those fruits are. Massive agricultural industries, endless grocery store shelf space, entire marketing campaigns built around their health benefits. Yet this relatively unknown Andean fruit quietly outperformed them in antioxidant measurements. A single serving delivers major vitamin C alongside beta-carotene, vitamin E, vitamin B6, potassium, iron, magnesium, and chlorogenic acid, a compound studied for anti-inflammatory and metabolic effects in peer-reviewed research, indexed through the National Institutes of Health. Research published in PMC linked the fruit's anthocyanin and flavonoid content to antioxidant activity surpassing many commercially dominant fruits. This is not some decorative novelty for collectors. This is a biologically sophisticated food system hiding in plain sight, while millions of people restart fragile annual gardens from scratch every single year. And the preparation is almost absurdly simple. Drop the fruit into boiling water for around 30 seconds, remove it, let it cool briefly. The skin peels away beneath your fingers almost effortlessly. Inside is dense, vividly colored flesh, balanced somewhere between tomato, plum, and passion fruit in flavor. Eat it raw, blend it into drinks, cook it into sauces, reduce it into preserves. Indigenous Andean communities have done exactly that for generations stretching back long before industrial agriculture existed. But the deeper story is not just about flavor or nutrition, it is about labor. Think about how much work modern gardening culture quietly normalizes. Starting seeds indoors, hardening off seedlings, rebuilding cages, constant pruning, fertilizing, watering schedules, pest management, replacing dead plants, rebuying supplies. Entire weekends disappear, maintaining fragile annual systems that die a few months later anyway. Most people never stop to ask why food production became so dependent on endless restarting. The Tamarillo disrupts that relationship completely. Once established, it behaves more like infrastructure than a seasonal crop. The root system deepens, the trunk thickens, the canopy expands. Every year the tree becomes more productive, rather than resetting back to zero. It matures alongside the people growing it. And perhaps that is exactly why plants like this faded from mainstream visibility, because permanence is difficult to monetize. A customer who plants once and harvests for 20 years is economically less valuable than one who must rebuild everything every spring. During World War II, when Victory Gardens spread across the United States and supplied enormous amounts of domestic produce, perennial food systems were considered extremely valuable, precisely because they reduced dependence on unstable supply chains. Families needed food security with minimal recurring input. Plants capable of producing continuously without annual restarting represented resilience. But after the war ended, industrial food infrastructure expanded rapidly. Grocery systems exploded outward. Suburban development replaced productive gardens with lawns. Commercial nurseries increasingly prioritized crops, guaranteeing yearly purchases. Tomatoes, peppers, squash, annual vegetables that expired quickly and ensured customers returned again the following season. Seed catalogs shifted toward seasonal dependency. Gardening culture shifted toward convenience products. Chemical fertilizers became normalized. Disposable gardening systems became standard. It only took 1 or 2 generations for plants like Tamarillo to fade almost completely from public awareness across the United States. And yet the tree never disappeared globally. It continued growing throughout New Zealand, Colombia, Ecuador, East Africa, and subtropical regions across multiple continents. Entire populations continued eating it while millions of Americans gradually forgot it existed at all. And if you are still watching right now, I want you to think carefully about something. How many other perennial food plants quietly disappeared from mainstream culture simply because they did not fit the dominant gardening economy? Because Tamarillo is almost certainly not the only one. There are likely dozens of highly productive perennial food systems sitting outside mainstream awareness simply because they reduce dependency on recurring purchases. You can still grow Tamarillo today. In USDA zones 8 through 11, Tamarillo performs outdoors year-round. In colder climates, growers use containers and move plants under protection during freezing temperatures. Mature trees tolerate brief cold surprisingly well, though hard freezes can damage exposed branches. The California Rare Fruit Growers Association documented successful fruiting trees in Northern California locations farther inland than many gardeners assume possible. The plant is self-fertile. You do not need multiple trees for pollination. Fruit production can begin within roughly 18 months under favorable conditions. The tree prefers shelter from strong wind because shallow roots and fruit-heavy branches can become vulnerable under stress. During establishment, it appreciates consistent watering and nutrient-rich soil. Afterward, it becomes remarkably low maintenance compared to conventional annual vegetable systems. Plant it once, protect it early, harvest for years. And the harvest itself feels fundamentally different from standard gardening. Instead of racing against frost before the entire plant collapses, you are gathering fruit from a living structure designed for continuity. The tree keeps growing, keeps strengthening, keeps producing. That changes your relationship with food. It changes your relationship with time. Instead of thinking seasonally, you begin thinking generationally. A mature Tamarillo tree starts behaving less like a crop and more like part of the landscape itself. Something stable, something dependable, something alive that continues giving long after the original planting. And that may be the deeper pattern hidden inside this entire story. The plants capable of producing continuously, storing naturally, surviving for years, and reducing dependence on constant replanting are often strangely absent from mainstream gardening conversations. Not because they are useless, not because they are impossible to grow, but because systems built around recurring consumption rarely prioritize permanence. A plant that feeds you for decades asks far less from commercial infrastructure than one requiring annual replacement. The Tamarillo quietly breaks that cycle simply by existing. And now you know it exists too. If this opened a door you did not know was there, press like, drop your climate zone in the comments, and subscribe to Roots Insider, because the next plant we uncover has survived mountain civilizations for over 5,000 years, and almost nobody in modern gardening culture talks about it anymore.